So welcome back guys, and in this series, in these videos, I'll be taking you through queues, and this is the first video of the many videos that I'll make concerning how to use queues in Laravel. Queues has been a topic of discussion over the years on how to improve your performance, or rather the performance of your application. And many people sometimes they use queues and they don't really utilize the full power of queues, or sometimes they just use queues anyhowly without knowing the best cases, the best scenario on how to use queues. All right. So this will be the first video that I'll be just giving you an overview of what really is a queue and how they are utilized in order to improve the performance of your application. So without further ado, let us dive in and see what really is a queue. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to let me just pull my paint guy here so I can be able to explain as we go along. So many a times when you build an application goes through, let me say, a series of processes, yeah, or a series of events, yeah. And these events, they are synchronous. They are not asynchronous. Uh, they happen per step. So they do not happen concurrently, but rather per step. So for example, in Laravel, you can have the first step here, which will be the validation step. All right, let me just say this. And then usually what you'll do after the validation is that uh, you'll have the second step, usually, which will be maybe to store the user in the database. Maybe you're storing some model, yeah, or whatever the model in the database. And maybe the third step will be usually to send a confirmation email. All right, so that will be the third step. And let me just add one more step here, which will be maybe to respond or give a response to the user. So these are four steps. And when you're using Laravel, or let me say any application, when a user submits a request to create an account, it will have to go to the step one, then step two, and then step three, and then step four. All right. And what happened is that if this step two and step three here, they are slow, then it means the overall step, the time taken by this four step will be slow. Let us say, for example, it takes 4 seconds, yeah? And then what happened is that maybe you add some code in this second step and the third step, and now the application takes maybe 6 seconds. All right. So what happened is that every user that will be signing up in your application will averagely have to take 6 seconds before he gets a response that his account or our account has been created. And this is not a good experience generally for your application. You want users to have a smooth, a very straightforward experience whereby once they've just submitted data to your application, you want it to take at least, or rather at most, maybe 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Yeah. So how can you be able to improve this and make your application much better? So in Laravel, nowadays there are quite a number of tools that have been, let me say, not really invented, or rather that have been built by developers. And one of the things that has been gaining prominence of late is what we call the Laravel Octane. All right, the Laravel Octane, the Laravel Octane. So what Octane does is that, in the simplest way, is that it gives you the power to run the processes or the steps in your application concurrently. All right. So for example, in our step now, we had 4 steps, and in order to improve this, maybe you can have the first step here. All right. This is the first step. So we have the first step here. All right. And then instead of running the second step and the third step, in a synchronous manner, you can be able to organize, or rather, you can able to utilize Octane in order to run them asynchronously, or rather, let me say concurrently. So the first pipeline that you had, it was running 4 steps like this, one, two, like this, and it was taking you 6 seconds. All right. But once you utilize Octane to run your application concurrently, or rather to run some parts of your application concurrently, in this case, step 2 and step 3, storing the user and sending the email concurrently, the application now may reduce to around 4 seconds, all right? Because this second and the third step, they're running at the same time. So the performance of the application will improve. But now, generally, not just to refute, the performance or rather the use of Octane, but personally, I prefer using queues. And that is because when using Octane, I believe you are supposed to install a quite number of functions and quite number of third-party application so that your application works perfectly. Which for me personally, I don't prefer that. I prefer using queues by default. So what queues does now, queues is quite an interesting, feature in Laravel. And what happens now? Let us say you have the normal. This should be. We have the 4 steps of your application like this. All right. And so what happens is that you can be able to remove these two parts. You see the second and the third step and move it to a queue. So a queue, as the name suggests, is just a queue. Yeah, it's just let me say like a store whereby you store your task and then you execute them in the background, all right? And you store them in maybe in an order, maybe fast in, fast out, whatever. And that is why it is called a queue. So you push your task in that queue and then you execute them in the background. So what this will do to application is that now step 2 and step 3, when you move them to the queue, your application performance will move down to, let me say, around 1 second or even 2 seconds at most. Yeah. And what happened is that if this the tasks which have been put in a queue, they're executed by by workers. Workers are just, let me say, their components which are used to execute the task that in the queue. So when these tasks have been pushed to a queue, then if we have the workers running or the workers active, they will look onto the queue and say, oh, I think there's some task that has arrived in the queue. What do I need to do? I need to execute this task. All right. But the good thing is that this thing is all happening in the background, and in the front end now, in the user interaction is quite fast. Why? Because the user is only seeing 2 steps, yeah, or rather is experiencing, the delay of only 2 steps, which is quite really amazing. So in the background, it might take 5 seconds, it might take 6 seconds, but still that is good. And in our case here, we might push something like sending email. I usually do that a lot. You push that in a queue, and then the response that the user gets will be instant. And then you will give him maybe a response, a message, and tell him that a confirmation email has been sent to your email. Please check your email. And by the time this guy opens up his email, he just checks out his email, then the queue will have already done its work and push this confirmation email to the user. So that is what basically queues does, yeah, right? So they just basically store different tasks or jobs into a pipeline, which is later executed by the components known as workers. All right. So I hope you guys have been able to understand what are queues and how they can be able to improve your application performance, especially in Laravel. And with that, guys, check out my next video where I'll be starting to do this practically in code and see how we can be able to improve the performance of our application. Goodbye and happy coding.